The search for a new vehicle to replace the light tank M24 started pretty much as soon as the war was ended in 1946. Two prototype vehicles were created, the T-37 and T-41, both around basically a common chassis with the Continental engine and the cross-drive transmission. Pretty quickly it became obvious that the T-41 with the high velocity cannon was going to be the one to go for, and that's where the attention went. In 1953 it was type classified as the M41 and named in honor of General Walker, who had just been killed in Korea. Originally it was going to be called the Little Bulldog, and then they simply renamed it the Walker Bulldog. Now the M41 had a simplified fire control system. The original idea was it was going to have an integrated fire control suite by Vickers, integrating a rangefinder, stabilizers, the works. The problem was it just really wasn't ready for prime time, and it was a case of either get the tank now or just wait until God knows when and the fire control system would actually be working. So the simplified version on the M41 though was deemed to be a little bit inadequate, so a newer version was created in the M41A1. This particular A1 comes with the markings of Guatemala and is now in the inventory of the Rock Island Auction Company. It's going to be put on the auction block in a week or two, and they've invited me around, as ever, you've seen it on the other vehicles, to take a quick tour around and see what makes it tick. Now I have done a snapshot of an M41 before, but it was literally just that, a quick 5-minute overview. So let's see if we can do a little bit more depth this time. This particular vehicle is a sort of a late early or an early mid production vehicle. You'll see some of the tells as we walk around. The vehicle is described in the manual as a lightly armored combat vehicle of low silhouette, fully tracked, with a crew of 4 and a 76mm high velocity gun. Lightly armored it was. The front slope here at 60 degrees is only an inch thick. You're more like an inch and a half down below, but that's sloped only at 45. So basically anything much heavier than a heavy machine gun is going to go through this. This is a light tank. As you look around the various parts of the vehicle, the first thing I'm going to point you to is this angled fender. Now the earliest production vehicles had a straight fender, and then later on, about mid-production, they changed it to the angle. However, because of one or two other features on this tank, I have a suspicion that these fenders are not the original ones that were on it when it left the factory, because if you look at the serial numbers, I think it's a little bit later. As you go along a little bit, of course, the all-important lifting eyes, because hey, your tank factory is nowhere near where any of the fighting is. Infrared headlight, service white light headlight, marker light. If you look up onto the mantlet, you can see where the gunner's auxiliary sight is housed, and it is behind a protective armored shield, which has to be removed out of the way before you get going. Of course, you have the later model muzzle brake and the fume extractor on the main gun. Keep going, you can see obviously the driver's hatch with the stops. Blackout drive, again, IR and white light headlights. And of course, down below you've got the mount for your towing clevises. The side brings us, of course, to the running gear. 5 pairs of road wheels on torsion bars with swing arms. You'll see that there are shock absorbers on the 1st, 2nd and 5th axles, and there are also volute spring bump stops to stop the swing arm swinging a bit too far. The front road wheel, as was pretty common for a lot of the post-war tanks, is physically connected to the idler wheel, so that as the road wheel comes forward, the idler is actually pushed outwards a little bit to maintain the tension on the track, and probably also to make sure that the road wheel has some room to move up. The tracks, they are, as you can see, single pin, 75 per side with a center guide, held in place with a locking nut, nice and simple. The whole system will span a 6-foot trench. The pads are replaceable on the outside. You can see the single bolt which holds each pad in place. So of course, when you're replacing your worn out track pads, you're looking at 75 per side. That's going to take you a while. It is also possible to remove a couple of track pads and just leave them as plain metal, and that might give you a little bit extra traction in icy conditions. Not every track pad, just every couple. Track tension is done at the front of the tank. So one moment while I relocate. The mechanism for track tension is simplicity itself. You can see there's a little locking plate here. Remove the nut that holds the locking plate in place, out of the way. This now allows you to rotate the main adjusting nut. Once that's done, place your locking plate back in where it was, put the nut in, and you're done. No problem. The vehicle is certainly well kitted out with stowage. You have sponson bins on both sides. You have the strap mounts for your backpacks or duffel bags. You can also tie them onto these hand grabs here. Plus, in addition, you have the extension to the bustle, which is a large stowage bin as well. So the crew are quite happy. They have lots of room for all the BII, the basic issue equipment, the tools that come with the tank, as well as their personal gear. At the back of the tank, well, next to the left-hand muffler, you're going to see the travel lock for the 76mm. And it is very simple, spring-loaded latch, nothing unusual or fancy. Above the tail light, your left battery packs are going to be in here. The right battery is obviously on the mirror side. As you move along, you have an access port that they have thoughtfully provided for the differential, where you can get your dipstick and add your fluids as necessary. Underneath, pintle, if you wanted to tow something. Of course, towing things with tanks has always been a questionable practice. And as we come further left, it looks like we have ourselves an infantry telephone. Now, through the magic of editing, I'm going to make some of these panels open without even lifting a finger. There you go. Now, the big large thing that's the first thing you're going to draw your attention to is the CD 500-3. That's the transmission. It is the cross drive CD, 500, i.e. 500 horsepower inbound, 3 speeds, 2 forward, 1 reverse. And it performs the braking and steering functions as well as your gearing ratios. Forward of that, you'll find the engine, the Continental AOS 895-3. A for air-cooled, O for opposed piston, S for supercharged. The 895 is the displacement in cubic inches of the 6 cylinders, and the Dash 3 is just a generation model. Now, the Dash 3s were carbureted, but in the interest of a bit of fuel efficiency, the Army looked at putting in fuel injection, and indeed it was more efficient by almost 20%. So the Dash 5 is the fuel injected version. A lot of the M41s that had the Dash 3 were converted midlife to Dash 5. This is not one of them. The engine puts out 500 horsepower, which matches nicely to the 500 horsepower input of the transmission, and 960 foot-pounds of torque. 11 gallons of oil are required to keep it lubricated. Fuel consumption, well, the 140 gallons of 80 octane were estimated to get the tank on or about 100 miles. When you have the fuel injected version, it goes up, they say, between 110 to 120. The fuel is added, it's actually a little bit underneath the bustle on the left hand side. You might have to swing the turret around just a tad to get at it. Now that I've come around to the right hand side of the tank, 3 things to call your attention to. Firstly, the position of the auxiliary motor exhaust, which is on top of the main motor exhaust on the right hand side. This led to a number of overheating problems very quickly, so production soon changed to mount the auxiliary engine's exhaust on the right fender on the front. Obviously, this hasn't been done here, so it's an indicator of an earlier vehicle. However, if you look at the weld line on the turret, you'll see that it is not an early production turret. It's more of a mid-production change. The early ones had a different design to the welds. Third thing to note is way up top, the rather bulky looking TC's cupola, which we'll have a look at next. Coming up and looking at the turret roof, well, it is again a very long extended bustle. At the very back of it is a blower for ventilation. Behind that, as mentioned, the stowage bin with jerry cans on each side. Radio antenna mount, a very simple opening hatch for the TC. A little bit high, it's not exactly low profile, but it does at least have the enhanced vision, shall we say, that started coming out at the end of World War II. Lastly, you look at the very far forward, you'll see the pintle for the caliber 50. It's a very tall pintle, and if you look at a photograph of it with the machine gun installed, it makes you wonder how you're supposed to shoot anybody and survive given how exposed you are. Well, remember that the caliber 50 was installed on American tanks in World War II era as an AA gun. Now, it happened that there was a lot more infantry and trucks to shoot at than there were aircraft, but that was the thinking behind it. You can also see the protective housings for the two gun sights for the commander and the gunner. And so we come to an end of this tour part 1, the exterior. Join us in a couple of days for part 2 when we go around and see what's inside. The gun option on the T41 was going to be better, although attempts to... Let's try it again. Damn it. Yeah, no harm. The vehicle is described in the manual as a lightly armoured, fully tracked vehicle capable of doing all sorts of wonderful things, because that's what the sales pitch said. It was determined that this actually led to a bit of an overheating problem in the mufflers, and so in mid-production and late production, the muffler